to something else that has been really important for me, and I think it'll be helpful for you as well. Um, I want to just share a thought, um, and it's a rhetorical question, but I want you to think about it throughout the day. And really, it's something that um, maybe next week we can come back together and you can answer. But my question is, and I ask myself this often, um, and it's sort of a way of helping to judge your journey, especially in times like this. And the first question is, what do you think about when you think about God? Like when you think about God, particularly during this time when all this stuff is going on, what do you think about? What's going on in your head, in your heart? Maybe even in just an abstract way. Um, and be honest with yourself. Uh, it's something that'll help you to sort of gauge your own spiritual health during this time when you're conscious of the thoughts that you have about God, especially during a difficult time. Like, what am I really thinking about God? And then here's a better question that'll help you even gauge your spiritual health during this time is, what do you think God thinks about when God thinks about you? Because I think a lot of times and I talked about this in the Proverbs series about trust. We oftentimes are very, very concerned about our thoughts about God and how right our thoughts are about God, and all that's important. But there has to come a reality where we understand that there's some things that I can't possibly know about what God is up to. There's just some things that we talked about Adam and Eve. One of their downfalls was is that they put their um, they put knowledge above trust, right? They wanted to know everything that God knew, which is why they ate the fruit. And all God asked them to do is trust me. Even when you can't know everything I know, just trust me. And so a lot of times we emphasize faith as being how much we can know about God, and we should. Um, but I think sometimes if we really want to see where we are in our faith journey, not just asking what we think about God, especially during difficult times, but what do we think God thinks about when God is thinking about us? That's not a question we ask ourselves a lot, right? When God is thinking about you, what do you think He's thinking about? Um, and the reason why that's important is because it helps us to have more faith and more confidence when we take the focus off of what we think about God and start to try to understand what God thinks about us, what God thinks about me, even during these difficult times. And one of the stories that I love that sort of helps to center me is the story of Job. Um, now, like we all sort of know this story, so I'm not going to read all of it. Um, I don't know if you knew this, but Job is actually the oldest book, the oldest written book of the Bible. A lot of times people get confused. They're like, "What about Genesis and all those?" Those tell older stories, but the actual oldest book that was written um, for the Jewish people in their Old Testament, which would have been their Bible, was the book of Job. And so that book for them carried a lot of wisdom. We just came out of Proverbs. We talked about Proverbs being wisdom literature. For them, Job, because it's considered the oldest book, is the oldest written book. It carries a lot of wisdom, and it carries a lot of wisdom about God, about human nature, and even about what they thought God thought about them, which is super important. Western Christianity, we don't think about that a lot because we're more concerned about what we think about God. But I promise you, if you look at scripture and you look at the nature of God, and you start to focus on what does God think about me, um, it sort of helps to center your spiritual life. As Mimi said, it helps you to not have a pity party, right? Because you're focusing on uh, what God thinks about you and how God feels about you. So I want to read just a couple verses from the book of Job. This is actually chapter 2. So Job Um, it says that angels show up to report to God. I'm paraphrasing. Angels show up to report to God. Satan shows up with them, which lets you know right there um, that good and evil coexist at the same time and often in the same space, right? And so I think even when we have questions about why is all this stuff happening, why do bad things happen to good people, one of the things that the book of Job tells us from the jump is that in the world that you live in, good and evil coexist in the same space. So you have the angels and Satan all showing up in the same space, but all having to report to God ultimately, right? Um, and so we know the story. You know, God asked Satan, "What are you doing? What have you been up to?" He's like, "Oh, I've just been doing my thing. You know, messing with people, messing with their finances, messing with their money, messing with their minds. You know, doing my regular." And God basically recommends Job, right? Now, before I read this, here's the thing that's often misunderstood. We have been taught that this story is about Job being tested. And that's not really what this book is about. It's not about Job being tested. It's about Satan testing God. And I'll share with you why in a second here. Second chapter of Job. This is the second time that Satan goes back, and this is verse 3. Then the Lord asked Satan, "Have you noticed my servant Job?" Again, this is the second time. He said, "He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. And he has maintained his integrity, even though you urged me to harm him without cause." So God is saying, look, you're still trying to prove something here. Let me give you a second shot at Job. Because even though you remember the first sort of wave of tragedy, he lost his whole family. He lost a lot of things. You can read it. And God says, you know, even though he lost all that stuff, he still kept his integrity. So you want to take another shot at him, go for it. And so Satan replies in verse 4, "Skin for skin, a man will give up everything he has to save his life, but reach out and take away his health, and he will surely curse you to your face." So what Satan is saying is, when he says skin for skin, he's basically saying that, look, Job kept his integrity, but let's be honest, God, the only reason why he kept his integrity is because he's the one who got away. Yeah, he misses his family, he misses his wife, he misses all of the riches that he lost. But let's be honest, the only reason why he still trusts you is because you didn't touch him. And so he says, I tell you what, Job is selfish. He's the type of person, and really, so this is really an illustration of humanity. He's saying that, God, you are so proud of these humans that you created. But what you don't realize is the only reason why they love you and trust you is because you give them stuff. And so here it is, God, I'm going to prove to you that humans don't really love you the way that you think they do. They can't possibly love you. The only reason why they love you is because you give them stuff. And you're trying to make an example out of Job, but the reality is Job is sad, but you didn't touch him. So that's why he still trusts you. So Satan is really testing God and saying that, you know what, God, here's what I think about you. I think that you brag on these humans and their ability to love, but the reality is that you've manipulated them into loving you because you keep blessing them with stuff. Take away all this stuff and we'll see if they really have the capacity to love you the way they say they do. And so you see the whole thing, the real test is not even really about Job. It's about something that I want us to focus on. And that is, and I often have this conversation with people when they say, why should I believe in God? When I talk to people who are not believers. And I said, you know, in a strange sort of way, you should believe in God because God believes in you. That God believes that we have the capacity, because we're created in his image, to love unconditionally. And God is rooting for us. Here's the trip. Unconditional love can only be proved in undesirable conditions. That's the only way that it can be proven, right? And this is really what Satan is testing God with. He's saying, you created these humans in your image, and you say they have the capacity to love unconditionally, but let's be real, God. The only reason why they love you or even halfway love each other is because you keep giving them stuff. And Job is no different. And I bet you if you mess with his health, he'll curse you because they don't really want you. They just want your stuff. And you, God, so Satan is accusing God of manipulating human beings into loving him. And God says, no, I'll let you do the worst that you can throw at him because I believe that when it's all said and done, no matter how tough it gets, he'll still love me. And so I share that to say that a lot of times when stuff like this happens, and there's undesirable conditions, we start to think about our thoughts about what we think about God, right? God, why did you do this? Why? How could you let this happen? And those are very valid questions. But the real question is, when you're going through something difficult, ask yourself, what does God think about me? And when God is thinking about me, what is God thinking about? Here's what I believe ultimately at the foundation of this whole thing is that God really, truly believes that you and I have the capacity to love unconditionally. The problem is the only way that that can be proven is you got to run into some undesirable conditions in order for that to be proven. And so I want to just leave you with this, that God absolutely believes that we have the capacity to love without condition. But that means that it has to be done in unwanted, unwarranted, and sometimes unnecessary conditions. Job didn't deserve anything that happened to him. But the real question was not in that moment what he thought about God. The question was, do you trust what God is saying that he believes about you? He believes that even during this pandemic, when people are losing their jobs, when politics are getting ugly, when God believes that we can do it. He believes that even in the midst of all of this stuff, God is rooting on us because he says, you know what, you have it in you to love me unconditionally and to love each other unconditionally. And the only way sometimes that can be proven is that you got to run into a whole heap of mess in order for us to disprove Satan's theory that the only reason why we love God is because God gives us stuff. And so God created us with that capacity to be able to be just like him in our ability to love unconditionally. And that opens up a whole world of things that are unwanted, sometimes feel unnecessary, but don't allow it to let us become unloving. So here's what I want to leave you with, because the longer this thing goes on, the harder it's going to get if I keep trying to focus on what I think about God. And you should have, study the word, pray, all that. And we want to have correct thoughts about God. If you notice after this, I think it goes on for some 40 more chapters and God doesn't say a word, right? Job's friends are complaining. And then finally, when it gets to the point where his friends, after sitting with him and lamenting with him, and that's a whole lesson I can give about, we don't really sit and lament about things. But after spending all that time with Job, they finally opened their mouth. You can read it. I think Job is 42 chapters or 43 chapters. For 40 chapters, God doesn't say a word. He lets Job vent. He lets his friends. The only time that God speaks up, because remember, when this conversation is happening, Job is not in on what God and Satan are talking about. All Job knows is what he's experiencing. He doesn't have access to what God thinks about him and what God thinks about his capacity to love. He just knows bad stuff is happening to me, right? And the only time that God actually speaks up and speaks to Job and his friends directly is when Job's friends try to get Job to admit that he did something wrong. And Job is like, I didn't do anything wrong. And they, in essence, tell Job, here's why this is happening to you, is because you did something so wrong that God doesn't love you anymore. And that's the only time that God speaks up, because now they are assassinating God's character. God says, wait a minute, I let you complain. I let you whine. I let you vent. You can do all that. It doesn't hurt my feelings one bit. But what you're not going to do is have people think that they can do something so bad that I can stop loving them. And so, what God believes about us, especially during this time, is even more important. I'm not saying what you believe about God is not important, but what God believes about us is more important in this moment than what we believe about God. And what does God believe about us? That you can do it. You have the capacity to love unconditionally. And that means even during a time where you're losing, where things are crazy, where people are getting on your last nerve because of politics and all this other stuff, right? God is cheering us on and says, I believe in you. And that's why I think even in those moments when your faith gets low, you can believe in God because God believes in you. He believes you can do it. And he's willing to put it all on the line to prove Satan wrong, that we can love unconditionally. So I want to encourage you to really anchor your faith, not just in what you believe about God, but in what God believes about you are able to do, and see if that doesn't help strengthen you just a little bit. Because when God has that much confidence in you, it gives you it gives you an anchor to say, you know what, I can do it. God does believe I can do it. I can do it. So